this is Jose Figueroa with an approved workman where we are rightly dividing the word of truth. Welcome to another week of Bible study. I am glad that you're here as we open up God's Word one more time. Our current series is Rebuilding the Covenant Community, a study of the book of Nehemiah. If you're new to this Bible teaching ministry, here's how you can learn more about our work. You can go to our website, www.anapprovedworkman.org. That's anapprovedworkman altogether.org. You can learn about the purpose for this ministry, our approach to Bible study, and review our statement of faith. You can listen to previous episodes of our current series or any episodes from previous series. On the website, you can also subscribe to the podcast, which is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Amazon Music, as well as other podcast directories. You can connect with us on social media, on Instagram at anapprovedworkman, on Pinterest, pinterest.com/anapprovedworkman, and on Facebook, our Facebook page, facebook.com/anapprovedworkman215. Finally, there are also video versions of our Bible study lessons. They're available on YouTube at youtube.com/@anapprovedworkman215. That's our handle. And on Rumble, rumble.com/c/anapprovedworkman. You can subscribe to those video channels and make sure you don't miss any upcoming episodes. Today, we're in lesson number 13 in the series Rebuilding the Covenant Community from the book of Nehemiah. This is volume 2 of our series After the Exile, a study of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. The lesson is titled Unfinished Business, Part 1. Our focus passage is Nehemiah 13, verses 1 through 14. So please find your way in your Bible to that passage. In this chapter, we see Nehemiah returning to Judah to rectify serious violations of the Torah. I love movies. I have quite a few favorites that I can watch anytime they come on TV. And I used to really look forward to the summer blockbuster season or the holiday season when the best movies were coming out. But lately, Hollywood has been more miss than hit. I have not really looked forward to any new movies for a couple of years now. There is one exception: anything with Tom Cruise. Somehow, he seems to be the only person who can create entertaining, memorable movies. In 2022, he pulled off an impossible feat. 36 years after the original Top Gun movie in 1986, he produced and starred in the sequel Top Gun Maverick. He honored the nostalgia and the story of the original movie while producing a terrific movie with a great story that pleased both old and new fans. I asked Claude AI to just do a little research for me. Just look at these numbers. Again, Top Gun was released in 1986, Top Gun Maverick 2022, the original Top Gun, an estimated 40 million tickets sold, the Top Gun Maverick, 65 million tickets sold. So about, a third of increase in terms of tickets sold. If you look at the gross profits, which again you have to account for inflation, the original made $357.3 million. The new one made $1.49 billion. And again, just look at those numbers, you can see that the sequel surpassed the original to the delight of everyone because we love that story. In this week's lesson, we are going to look at another sequel. We'll see Nehemiah come back to Jerusalem for a second term as governor. Here is a question: will he be as successful as in his first term? Will he encounter the same challenges or new ones? Let's find out. In our previous episode, we began our teaching on this last section of the book of Nehemiah, namely chapters 11 through 13. In our first division, we look at the organization of the people, Nehemiah 11:1 through 12:26. We saw that our life under God requires both individual commitment, and community. We're not to be lone rangers in the Christian life. We need to take our position and stand side by side with each other as we do work for God's glory and the good of others, both believers and unbelievers. In our second division, we look at the dedication of the wall, Nehemiah 12:27 through 47. Our focus was on a special ceremony led by Nehemiah and Ezra to dedicate the rebuilt Jerusalem walls. It was a beautiful ceremony filled with worship and a recommitment to follow the Torah, God's law. We should always remember that living according to God's ways requires wholehearted commitment and intentionality. So let's review the applications and principles from our study of Nehemiah chapters 11 and 12. First, again, the organization of the people, chapter 11, verse 1 through chapter 12, verse 26. Our principle, life under God requires sacrifice and commitment for the good of others. Life under God requires sacrifice and commitment for the good of others. Our application questions: what am I willing to sacrifice for the good of my covenant community? How willing am I to be counted and to commit to carry out what the Lord has called me to do for Him? What am I doing to understand what He has equipped me to do for the kingdom? Our second division was the dedication of the wall, Nehemiah 12:27 through 43. Our principle, life under God requires a heart of worship. Life under God requires a heart of worship. How am I celebrating God's work in my life? How am I worshiping Him on an ongoing basis for who He is and what He has done for me? How am I organizing to carry out the work He has called me to do for Him? And how am I applying the scriptures in my life on a daily basis? If you missed that previous episode, I encourage you to listen to the podcast or watch the video version of that lesson on either our YouTube channel or our Rumble channel. In today's lesson, we begin the study of the last chapter in the book of Nehemiah, chapter 13. As a way of reminder, let's see what happened at the end of Nehemiah 10 because it provides great context for this last chapter. The Jewish exiles made a series of commitments to the Lord as they renewed the covenant with Him. In chapter 10, verses 29 and 30, they committed to the prohibition of mixed marriages. They would not give their sons or daughters to marriage with the peoples of the land. In chapter 10, verse 31, they committed to honor the Sabbath. They would not buy from foreigners wares or grain on the Sabbath day or any other holiday. They would also forego the crops every seventh year, providing a Sabbath rest for the land, and would also forgive every debt. Then in chapter 10, verses 32 through 39, they committed to support the temple operations. They committed to provide the offerings and contributions required. They would also bring the first of their dough, their contributions, the fruit of every tree, the new wine, and the oil to the priests at the chambers of the temple, and the tithe of the ground to the Levites. In other words, they committed themselves to not neglect the temple of the Lord. And they had signed a document, a covenant. But was that enough? We have seen before in our series that people make all kinds of commitments all the time, and they don't honor them. Will the Jewish exiles follow through? They had a beautiful worship ceremony to dedicate the wall. It was a great time. Will it continue? Again, the people were well-intentioned if you look at that entire chapter 10. But their own history suggests that good intentions are not sufficient. We must purposely set out to do what we said we would do. It does not happen by accident. This chapter, chapter 13 of Nehemiah, reveals what happened after those great days of joy and worship. In his Bible commentary on Ezra-Nehemiah-Esther, Dr. J. Vernon McGee gives us useful context for this final chapter. He says, quote, "In chapter 13, we see again the demonstration that eternal vigilance is the price of freedom. It is the price of Christian liberty and Christian freedom too." Somewhere between chapters 12 and 13, Nehemiah returned to his job in the palace at Shushan. Remember that he had only asked for a leave of absence. He had been back in Persia for a while, maybe a year or two, when he asked for another leave of absence so that he could go to Jerusalem. End quote. In his commentary on Ezra-Nehemiah and Esther, Dr. Mervyn Brenneman also provides us with commentary on the context for this chapter and how it leaves us with some longing. He says, quote, "We may assume that most of chapter 13 originated in the Nehemiah memoirs. Like Ezra 9 and 10, it is anticlimactic after the dedication of the wall in chapter 12. Chapter 13 teaches the need for ongoing efforts to conserve revival. McConville is surely correct that such a disappointing conclusion to a book full of many triumphs causes in the reader a longing for the more complete and lasting spiritual restoration Scripture promises." End quote. Here is our lesson outline and goal for our teaching from Nehemiah chapter 13. For this chapter, we have three divisions as follows. First, the sin of neglecting the temple, chapter 13, verses 1 through 14. Then, the sin of profaning the Sabbath, chapter 13, verses 15 through 22. And finally, the third division, the sin of mixed marriages, chapter 13, verses 23 through 31. And our goal for this teaching from Nehemiah 13 is this: to encourage believers to remember that life with God requires devotion and continued vigilance to keep us going in the good way He has prepared for us. Again, the goal for the teaching from Nehemiah 13 is this: to encourage believers to remember that life with God requires devotion and continued vigilance to keep us going in the good way He has prepared for us. Today, we will focus on our first division, the sin of neglecting the temple. So let's get started and read from Nehemiah chapter 13, verses 1 through 14. On that day, the book of Moses was read aloud as the people listened, and there was found written in it that no Ammonite or Moabite was ever to enter the assembly of God, because they did not meet the sons of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. However, our God turned the curse into a blessing. So when they heard the law, they excluded all foreigners from Israel. Verse 4. Now, prior to this, Eliashib the priest, who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, being related to Tobiah, had prepared a large room for him, where previously they used to put the grain offerings, the frankincense, the utensils, and the tithes of grain, wine and oil prescribed for the Levites, the singers, and the gatekeepers, and the contributions for the priests. But during all this time, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had come to the king. After some time, however, I requested a leave of absence from the king, and I came to Jerusalem and learned about the evil that Eliashib had committed for Tobiah by preparing a room for him in the courtyards of the house of God. Verse 8. It was very displeasing to me, so I threw all of Tobiah's household articles out of the room. Then I gave an order, and they cleansed the rooms, and I returned the utensils of the house of God there with the grain offering and the frankincense. Verse 10. I also discovered that the portions of the Levites had not been given to them. So the Levites and the singers who performed the service had gone away, each to his own field. So I reprimanded the officials and said, "Why has the house of God been neglected?" Then I gathered them together and stationed them at their posts. All Judah then brought the tithe of the grain, wine, and oil into the storehouses. Verse 13. To be in charge of the storehouses, I appointed Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, and Pedaiah from the Levites. And in addition to them was Hanan the son of Zakur, the son of Mattaniah for they were considered reliable, and it was their task to distribute to their kinsmen. Remember me for this, my God, and do not wipe out my loyal deeds, which I have performed for the house of my God and its services. Nehemiah 13, 1 through 14. Let's start looking at the first part of this chapter by looking at verses 1 to 3, the exclusion of foreigners. We're told that on that very day, as the people heard the words of the Torah, they realized that no Ammonite or Moabite was supposed to be a part of their assembly because of how they treated Israel as they traveled to the Promised Land. And we're told that they need to recall that indeed the Moabites hired Balaam to curse Israel. However, God turned that attempted curse into a blessing. The people decided to exclude all the foreigners from their assembly. This was their final act of commitment to the ways of Yahweh. Mixing up with other nations have been their downfall since the days of King Solomon. As you move ahead to verses 4 through 7, we see that there is an issue with Tobiah. In verses 4 and 5, we're told that before this time, Eliashib the priest, one of the priests who had the responsibility over the chambers of the temple, had prepared a large room for Tobiah, to whom he was related. And this room was previously designated to store the grain offerings, the frankincense, the utensils, the tithes of the grain, the wine and the oil prescribed for the Levites and the singers and the gatekeepers, and the contributions for the priests. So it was designated for holy purposes. Eliashib had basically turned it into a common storage area for Tobiah. It was a gross misuse of something that was supposed to be devoted to the Lord's temple, to the Lord's business. Dr. Brenneman speaks on the danger of Tobiah's influence on the covenant community. He says, quote, "From Nehemiah 6:10, we know that Tobiah was married to a Jew and was a key person in the opposition to Nehemiah's reforms. The priest, Eliashib, had given Tobiah a foothold right in the center of the Jewish community. All this distressed Nehemiah. Nehemiah saw all this as laxity in regard to maintaining cultic and religious purity. Eliashib was given a job to be in charge of the storerooms of the temple. His lack of responsibility allowed Tobiah to gain more and more influence in the community." End quote. So again, you see, this is a big problem, and Nehemiah is going to have to deal with it very decisively. Let's move ahead to verses 6 and 7. So how does this happen? Well, for one thing, Nehemiah was not in Jerusalem. Eliashib thought it more important to appease his father-in-law than to carry out his role for God and the people. In the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes, and after serving 12 years as governor between 445 and 433 BC, he was recalled to the court. But after a while, Nehemiah requested a leave of absence from the king and returned to Jerusalem. And that's when he found out what Eliashib had done for Tobiah. Dr. John MacArthur provides us with additional context for Nehemiah's return. He says, quote, "Nehemiah left Jerusalem in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, 433 BC, and returned to Persia as he had promised. During his absence, the people returned to their former ways, led by the high priest Eliashib. It was during Nehemiah's absence that Malachi also wrote his prophetic book, indicting both priests and people for their sinful deflection. Nehemiah 13 was the last portion of the Old Testament to be written." End quote. So what you see there at the end of the Old Testament, and if you read the book of the prophet Malachi, and we cover Malachi in our series, majoring in the minors, our study of the 12 minor prophets, you see that all these violations that we're going to see in this chapter were happening in that time, and Malachi is prosecuting the case against the people and the leadership, and Nehemiah has returned to try to stem the tide and reverse course on this neglect of their commitments that they had made to Yahweh back in chapter 10. Let's move ahead to verses 8 through 14, Nehemiah's corrective action. In verses 8 and 9, we're told that Nehemiah was displeased with this and threw all of Tobiah's belongings out of the room. He did not wait for anyone else to deal with this problem. Then he also ordered that the temple utensils and the grain offering and frankincense be returned to their proper location in that room. In his commentary on Ezra and Nehemiah, Dr. Derek Kidner speaks on this decisive action. He says, quote, "Unlike the ecclesiastics of the time, who could see all sides of a matter, including the side to support, Nehemiah stormed in as violently as one day his master would. Throughout this chapter, he stands out from his contemporaries by his refusal to allow for a moment that holiness is negotiable, or that custom alone can hallow anything." End quote. I love that perspective from Dr. Kidner. Holiness is not negotiable. You don't compromise in the matters that are essential to life under God. Nehemiah is reminding these leaders, convicting, challenging these leaders to follow their commitments, to follow what God prescribed. Holiness is not negotiable. Moving ahead to verses 10 and 11, Nehemiah also found out that the Levites had not been given their allocated portion. So the Levites and the singers had returned to their fields. They had to support their families. Nehemiah reprimanded the officials and asked him why the temple had been neglected. He gathered the Levites and the singers back to their posts. The people in Nehemiah's absence had neglected that commitment they made to support the temple operations. Back to Nehemiah 10:32 to 39. That's strike one. It seems that without his godly leadership, things were falling apart. And I think that's a troubling sign for the people of God when the absence of one leader or the retirement of one leader just leaves the people completely adrift, and nobody else takes up that mantle and continues with that effort. In his Bible commentary, Dr. Tony Evans speaks on how compromise can lead to spiritual decay. He says, quote, "The problem presented in verse 10 was a compromise of ministry. The things that mattered to people were put first, and the things of God were last. Thus, the portions of the Levites had not been given. And as the ministry went downhill, so the spiritual temperature of the people went downhill." End quote. In verses 12 and 13, we're told that finally the people of Judah began to bring the tithe of the grain and the wine and the oil into the storehouses, as they had committed before. Nehemiah knows he cannot trust Eliashib, so he appointed Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, Pedaiah one of the Levites, Hanan the son of Zakur the son of Mattaniah to be in charge of distributing the contributions. And this was because they were considered reliable and faithful. He needed people he could trust, and Eliashib, the high priest, or one of the priests, had completely failed. And of course, Eliashib, who's the same name, was a high priest. His leadership just fell apart too. Verse 14, this section closes with the first of three of Nehemiah's prayers as we look at these final chapters. He prayed to God to remember him and not wipe out his loyal deeds done for the house of his God and its services. And I see here both a desire for God to bless his efforts, but also I detect some sadness in the fact that despite his best efforts, the people were not committed to the Lord from their hearts. And he could not change this fact no matter how hard he tried. And he tried his best, but it was not enough. Still, he decided to continue to remind the people of the proper priorities. Well, that brings us to the end of this first division from Nehemiah 13. What's our principle? God's covenant people align their priorities with God's priorities. God's covenant people align their priorities with God's priorities. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be provided to you. Matthew 6:33. How am I neglecting God's priorities in my life? How am I neglecting or profaning my body, the temple of the Holy Spirit? This concludes part 1 of our teaching from Nehemiah 13. Thank you for being here today. Next time, we will focus on our second division, the sin of profaning the Sabbath, from verses 15 to 22, and our third division, the sin of mixed marriages, verses 23 through 31. Until then, this is Jose Figueroa for an approved warning, where we are rightly dividing the word of truth. May God richly bless you.